Welcome back, risers and thrivers. We are so excited to have you with us on this very special live recording today. We hope you have loved our last recording that featured Scott Lindgren, the extreme adventure athlete who has recently faced brain cancer diagnosis and who's experienced so many awakenings on this journey that has led him to live a completely different life in mindfulness, in awareness. And that was a fabulous recording and a fabulous show. So if you missed it, please visit Apple, Spotify, whatever your favorite streaming platform may be to access that show as well. And boy, do we ever have a show for you today. So here on the Rise Today Inspirational podcast, as you all know, we are just really passionate about opening up the story of hardship and sharing tools for others to stay the course and to even thrive through adversity and through hardship. And today we have a phenomenal guest who is going to discuss his experience in the residential schools. Now, if you're not familiar with Canada's best kept secrets, seemingly, the residential schools have impacted Indigenous communities from all across our great nation. And children were forced to attend these schools, basically with the intent of creating cultural genocide. Canada, this country that's known wide and far throughout the world to be so accepting of multiculturalism and welcoming different cultures, and yet the history that's happened here on our own grounds, it just takes my breath away. It's so shocking. And so Bruce will discuss this today and share his experience. Bruce, we welcome you to the show. Thank you for being here.
Hello.
I'll let everyone know Bruce is incredible. He is a member of the Stellarton First Nation and belongs to the Owl Clan, who sits with the Beaver Clan in the Nadella Stellan clan system. He's attended the Lejack Indian Residential School in northern British Columbia. He did so from 1967 until 1974. He's also an intergenerational survivor of the residential school traumas, as his father attended both Lejack School and Kamloops School as far back as 1949. Bruce received his bachelor degree of education from UBC in 1987 and further went on to achieve a master's degree in education as well. He now teaches at the New Canadian College. He teaches all about Aboriginal history, and he's a phenomenal inspiration. He's also a father and a grandfather, and is very conscious of the intergenerational trauma that these Indigenous communities have all been exposed to at the hand of the Canadian government. Bruce also passionately works as a support worker for the Indian Residential School Survivors Society to support survivors and intergenerational survivors as well. Bruce, thank you. Can you take us back, Bruce? Can you bring us back to your life as a child?
Hello. First of all, I'll just do a brief introduction, and I'd like to thank the Claytley Tenay Nation for allowing me to work and live in their territory. A lot of our people from Stellarton are related to the Claytley people as well. But if I'm going to talk about the Jack, I probably have to start with the intergenerational. The Jack started in 1922 at the Fraser Lake, at its Fraser Lake site, but the residential school itself started in 1910 in the Fort St. James area, and that's where it was until 1917 or close by to 1922 when they moved it to the Lejack location near Fraser Lake. When we talk about intergenerational, my grandmother attended Lejack from 1922 to 1928. So she was there for 6 years, and she passed away from tuberculosis. That was a common disease with residential school children. and that took a lot of lives and affected many more because they ended up in TB hospitals and things like that. My father attended from the Jack from 1942 to 1949, and then 49 to 54 at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Never talked about it. Definitely showed it. When I talk about um, the residential school experiences, I have to say that I was born into my healing journey because of the intergenerational trauma
What
and the
did that look
effects.
like? What did that look like for you, Bruce, growing up?
As a child, I very early on witnessed the violence from my father
Mm.
and the alcoholism from my father. So there was a lot of drinking very early on. Our household wasn't the only one. There were many houses in our community that were doing exactly the same thing because a lot of the parents at that time were survivors of the residential school, and how they coped with it was through drinking and drugging.
Just trying
And
to numb the pain.
yes, and at that time there were absolutely no support services for survivors. They, they just acted out their traumas, and it was through alcohol and it was through violence and watching my father become violent when he drank and he was violent towards my mother.
And these
And
were
so
all survival mechanisms that they had to
yes,
adopt from their own experiences, from childhood trauma, and from all that they had endured within those schools. Now, for our audience who perhaps may not know much about the residential schools, these children were taken from their homes and from their parents without even parent consent, sometimes without even parent knowledge, and they were forced to attend these schools. And I know Bruce is wearing this beautiful orange shirt today, and I know that that stems from, just the idea of these kids arriving at the school and having to lose all parts of them, right? Even the clothing that they had on their back. And this one girl, it stems from her story as a child of having to lose her orange shirt. And this shirt, Every Child Matters. It's so relevant. And we'll talk more about that later. But just wanted to give a little summary for those who may not be super familiar with the residential school systems and all that unfolded. And these are truths that are just really being uncovered here in Canada as we speak, right? Over the last couple of years, more recently, especially in the last few months. And so this is why we're really talking about this, is to create this healing and these ideas of reconciliation. But it's so important to propel the truths of all that unfolded in these schools and all that these children were made to endure, because just like Bruce is talking about it, even without his own experience of attending the school, this intergenerational trauma that still continues from those who attended the school even before us, of previous generations, right? That continues on through this community and through the Indigenous communities all across Canada. And we need to step in to help in healing efforts however we can. I'm exceedingly passionate about this story because where I grew up in Northern Ontario houses the Shingwak Residential School. And little did I know, just before I had moved in to this great neighborhood and had this idyllic backyard and this idyllic forest for the grounds of my childhood growing up, I didn't know, but marked the grounds of such torture and abuse for children just years before attending the residential school right there. And so we're propelling these truths and sharing this awareness. And Bruce, I can't thank you enough. So as you're growing up, you're noticing yourself, even these emotional avoidance strategies, right? That's present within the community, present within your own family, probably hard to connect, probably hard to feel that love and the connection because your own parents didn't receive that growing up because they were taken from their families, literally, and forced to attend these schools.
yes. Um, for my father and his siblings, his mother died when he was 7 years old. So immediately after her passing, his father, under the guidance of his grandmother, put them in the Lijak residential school, and um, I don't think my father ever forgave um, his dad for doing that.
Hmm.
But there is a bit of history of resistance too on my mother's side. She didn't go to the residential school like my dad did, and the reason she didn't go is because her father gave up his Indian status so that she didn't have to attend the Jack. And her father didn't want them at Lee Jack because of what happened in the night in 1937, January 1st, 1937. Four boys froze to death from running away from the Lee Jack school.
And they
So
were
my
running away from all the neglect and all the abuse that was happening in those
yes,
schools.
yeah, and the RCMP, if they did anything, they usually followed the lead of the church, people at the church or people who were running the school, and they didn't really do anything. And that was the case with runaways as well. But with runaways, the police were involved with the retrieving the children and bringing them back to their perpetrators, their abusers.
Mm.
And that quite often was the case. It was directed by the principal from the residential school. So um, you could read or you can hear story after story from survivors on how they ran away and why they ran away. And with very good reason. The food wasn't good. They weren't treated well, and they were being sexually abused. Most often than not, it was the sexual abuse that caused them to run away.
And were they allowed to see their parents at all?
Uh, you would hear some testimonies from clergy that says that parents they were allowed to visit their parents. That isn't the case at all.
Mm.
Um, these schools were closed to the public, so whatever was going on at the schools, nobody didn't know anything from the general public that these things were going on for well over 150 years,
Wow.
and so they had free reign. They had every the clergy and staff had every right and to do whatever they wanted with the children, and they did. And for me, this came out with talking to so many survivors. My father never shared any of his experiences. However, I talked to people who he went to school with, the staff members who were there when he was there at the same time, but also his peers were the ones that told me what happened to them, and they suffered brutal physical and sexual abuse at the hands of the priests and nuns. And so my father was not immune to that. He was very much in the middle of that, but was not able to share that um, while he was alive, but definitely demonstrated the effects of it.
Of
And
course.
yeah, so um, and if I were to talk about my own experiences, compared to those kids that had to stay at the school, um, my experience was probably half of that. I would say I have to be protected.
So, for our listeners to know, Bruce was not, he attended the residential schools, but he did not stay on the grounds overnight. So, he was bussed into the school.
Yeah. So yeah, but that doesn't uh, mean that whatever physical and sexual abuse that was occurring uh, at the school, day students, we call ourselves, day scholars, came to the school and went back home every day. But quite often staff members would physically abuse students uh, and sexually abuse them while they were at the school. So they got just as much abuses as the students who had to stay there. The ones that had to stay there, couldn't escape.
The ones that stayed there, were they there all summer too, Bruce?
There's there was a few of my dad's classmates who came from northern BC, Telegraph Creek, and Lower Post, who were put in Lejac, and they couldn't very well run away. That's a long trip for young boys to try to go back and retrace their steps, and they would have had to stay year round. There's a video called The North Boys, and the two survivors talk about going to Lejac at 7 years old and then leaving at 16 years old. So there were students that were there year round, and the orphans had to be there year round. So yeah, it was pretty horrendous for those that had to stay year round.
And did you witness abuse of others?
Yes, I was very much part of sitting in the boys' playroom. Like they call it a playroom, but it wasn't anything. It was anything but a playroom. It was more like a torture room. So boys would sit in the benches and in a circle, and in the middle, if anybody needed to be punished, whether it was on their hands, it would be done in front of everybody. And if it was really, if they really wanted to make sure that people didn't do what these boys did, they would, in front of everybody, pull their pants and their underwear right down and strap them with
Oh my God.
with a conveyor belt that was cut off. It was about 18 inches long, half an inch thick, and 3 inches wide. And a lot of the staff members carried these. They carried it in a holster, and anytime they needed to dish out punishment, they would do that right then and there. So it was a common scene: kids being strapped, kids being hit, kicked, knocked down. The violence was,
It's
ever
unfathomable.
present.
It's unfathomable to know that and it's not even that far back in history. I mean, this was still happening in what, 1975, sometimes even 1980 in some schools.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
unimaginable.
And yeah, I've seen kids get strapped with their bare bum in front of everybody. So you can imagine the humiliation.
Of course.
Yeah, the humiliation with that.
The shame.
Some of the kids would have cotton in their ears when they came to class, and I always wondered, well, why is that cotton got some yellow and green on it? And I don't want to catch, like, I thought it was a cold or sickness, something like that. But
Infection.
that's from having busted eardrums.
Oh my heavens.
And so kids would come in with both ears with cotton in there.
What were you made to feel? Like, what were you made to feel about yourself and about your community?
Well, as a child, you're just scared. Okay, what are the rules here? What do I have to do
To
to
survive.
stay safe, to survive? What do I have to do to not get into a fight with other kids? What do I have to do to stay away from that strap? Right. But there were other things that were going on. There was during my time at the Lee Jack School, there was a dorm supervisor by the name of Edward Fitzgerald. I'll name him because the police did pick him up in 1992, but the church shipped him off to the Catholic Church shipped him off to Ireland because Ireland doesn't have any extradition laws. So he didn't have to face any charges of sexual abuse. But Fitzgerald took care of the kids that were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old in what's called the junior dormitory, and he had his bedroom attached to that dormitory, so he had access to those boys 24/7,
We're babies.
360.
They're
Yeah,
babies. They're just babies.
oh yeah, and he did damage a lot of lives. Many of them committed suicide. Many of them died from drug and alcohol. Um, I think my time there was spared from him because of my dad. My dad knew because he went through the jack and he knew what kind of predators there were um, with the supervisors. And he brought my sister and I to the jack, and he said, I want to introduce you to the supervisors. And to me, that meant, okay, I don't know the supervisor, so he's going to introduce me to them. But that's not what he meant. What his meaning was, I'm going to introduce you to them so that they'll leave you alone.
He was
And
protecting you.
yeah, so he went to Edward Fitzgerald and he just said, "This is my son." And then after, I don't remember the conversation because I didn't stick around. I went to the playground, but they had a long conversation, and then uh, my path never crossed Edward Fitzgerald after that. And I think my dad, in no uncertain terms, threatened him. My dad was a hunter. He had some guns at home and things like that. So I would imagine he enlightened Fitzgerald that he would come and shoot him if anything happened to me.
So quiet. Very quiet, your dad, stoic about all that he experienced at the hands of these supervisors, but very protective of his children. And yeah. Did Indigenous children have the opportunity to go to other schools?
There was a public school in Fraser Lake. My mom attended in 1949, I believe. If they didn't have Indian status, they could go to the public school.
If they did not have Indian status?
Yeah.
So they had to give up their Indian status to attend the public school?
Yeah. So I think for the most part, all of us kids, there were some kids that stayed away from the jack that lived on the other end of the Lake Natley, but there was a few of them that still had to attend. But for the most part, we didn't have a choice. And I think the church party made a deal with the public school not to take any kids that they needed the tuition money that they got on our behalf. Right?
Do you feel right? That makes sense. Do you feel the intent of all of this was to create this cultural genocide?
Yes.
Yeah.
They would not allow us to speak the language. If you were caught speaking the language, then you got a severe strap right in front of everybody. So just to make sure that everybody wasn't going to do it, this person spoke the language, boom. So we weren't allowed to practice our culture. We weren't allowed to learn about it. Even though we did practice it, but it was severely affected by the residential school experience. And a lot of elders were kind of brainwashed from their attendance to the school. That
just a loss of all of your roots, a loss of all of your traditions, a loss of all that you knew to be home at such an age.
And the other thing that the church was doing too is because I attended, even though I was attending the Jack from 1967 to 1974, 1969, I went to St. Joseph's Catholic School in Vanderhoof for 1 year. and then I attended St. Joseph's Catholic School in 1972, so grade 3 and grade 6. But when I asked for my records from the federal government, they have me at Jack right from 67 to 74. So they were
Wow.
the same church was double dipping. I think they did that quite a bit.
Wow. I think we're having a few connection issues here, but can you hear me okay, Bruce?
Yes, I can.
Okay. And so you're going through all of this abuse. This is just, does it become normal or do you just constantly live in fear?
There's always a fear. What's going to happen? You have to watch out because you're getting bullied at the same time, and you know, you're you're getting a somebody's bullying you, and so you don't if you don't stand up to them, they're going to keep doing it.
I know when
So
we
there's
spoke on
always a chance of getting.
I know when we spoke on the phone, you were talking about the kids who were at the school full time, were residents of the residential school, and that they were envious of you for coming to school on the bus and who had the chance to leave. And so you experienced bullying and abuse from those children too.
As well as the staff. Yeah, the staff members had the same views as the kids who had to stay there.
Right. So tell us, despite all that you've endured, I find it just remarkable, the success that you've gone on to have. What were some of the tools that helped you do all of that, Bruce?
Well, I think when I look back at my experiences, and it was kind of put on hold, even though I was getting an education. I was learning about the Indian Act and all of those things. But going back to my community to work after getting a degree, a an Indigenous therapist counselor by the name of Bill Mussel came to our community and started talking about uh, Indian residential schools in 1992. By this time, that topic was rare by our people. Um, my father passed in 1979 from his routine of going to the bar every weekend. That was his coping mechanism, but that's what killed him. Um, the bar was only 5 kilometers away from our home, and um, on March 17th, 1979, he was walking back home, and he got exactly back. He was struck and killed by a pickup truck that my cousin was driving. And so he was hit from behind. He didn't feel anything. He was killed instantly from just the trauma of being struck by a vehicle at probably 100 kilometers an hour. So, needless to say, his casket was closed. Yeah, so it's instant. And so lots of anger towards my cousin, but for years, it was his fault. He was drinking and driving and all that. But I got my eyes opened up with talking to Bill Mussel, who was a counselor, and started talking to me and saying things like, well, alcohol and drugs are just a symptom to what the real problems are in our communities.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that started my thinking. And so I was looking back and I go, okay, well, why was my dad on the road? Well, he was drinking. That's what killed him. Now,
Mm-hmm.
why was he drinking was the big question. Why did he drink so much? So started to look at the residential school experiences. I learned more to not look at the symptoms, but to look at the real issues, which was all of the abuses that my dad went through. I ended up talking to my cousin, forgiving him for what happened, and that took a huge weight off my shoulders. And I felt way lighter after doing that. Um, Bill Muscle was really good. He would ask you questions like, "What's your deepest, darkest secrets?" And you would tell him. You would talk about the abuses that you went through,
And that's
and so that
so
started
important.
my.
That's so important because as soon as we own our story, right, and start talking about our story, and we own the truths of what happened, no one can really use it against us, not even our own selves in terms of self-judgment. Because once we put it out there, but when we keep it inside, gosh, the self-judgment that we impose on ourselves, it can eat us alive through alcohol, through drugs, and through all of those measures. So this talking therapy that he encouraged you to tell your story, so powerful.
Yeah. So that was in 1992. So yeah. And what else started my healing journey was uh, working with elders from 2000 and to 2004. Called the group was called Healing the Healers. So I was a coordinator for getting about 22 elders gathered together to do work on residential school issues. So a lot of these elders did go to Lee Jack, and a lot of them wouldn't talk about it, especially the men. But the women were the ones that would step forward and say, they modeled the healing that needed to be done. They were telling their stories and sharing their life experiences, but at the same time, they did model it, and humor was a huge part of that healing.
Very important.
Even though one elder just passed away Friday, um, I can remember her story. She was 89 when she passed, but I can remember her stories 20 years ago, talking about herself. Um, Her mother passed away when she was 10, and she wasn't allowed to go to the funeral. The people at the residential school wouldn't let her go back home to her mom's funeral.
Oh.
And but she shared a story of her marriage. She was married to a residential school survivor, and he beat the crap out of her all the time. That was just the way things were. And so that gave me insights to what my dad was doing. But she would kind of put humor in it too. She would, even though it's hard to put humor in that, but she said, yeah, after every weekend, all of us women looked like raccoons because of they had both of their eyes blackened over the weekend. And she said all the women had that. And so, getting them, working with them really brought me to a place of healing. And whatever they had to do, if they were talking to counselors, I talked to counselors. If we went to workshops, I participated in those workshops. If we went to conferences, whether there were residential school conferences or sexual abuse conferences, we attended all together, and we went to all of these workshops together. Um, and we went to culture camps, elders gatherings. We did quite a bit of traveling in our territory and sharing stories. But I think the one of the things that I did was to do a fasting ceremony, a vision quest. And what my vision quest was to I asked the medicine man for the strength to heal myself, but also the strength to listen to the many stories of survivors that haven't been told, and not to take it in, not to take in the sadness, not to take in the anger. And so fasting 4 days, that's going without water and going without food for 4 days and 4 nights. I achieved that. And the medicine man said, yes, you've got the strength to work with survivors. And today I can listen to so many stories, and I know it doesn't belong to me. I know that it's their story and it's not mine. So, but I can be there to support them, and I can be angry with them, and I can be sad with them at the same time, and
The
just,
ability to truly hear in what you're talking about, right? So few of us really want to do that. We all want to fix a problem. And so we often don't have the ability just to sit and truly hear what someone's pain is and give them that really safe space to experience that emotional pain. And that's one of the biggest gifts we can give to anyone, is just to hear and to listen to hear. Ken, thank you for your comment. And gosh, alcohol related death and witnessing your father go through that, I can't imagine. And, alcohol is number one, trying to hide that emotional pain, right? Trying to avoid it, trying to numb those experiences that we've had, trying to push that down, just an emotional avoidance strategy. He experienced abuse in Catholic boarding school. Interesting. In St.
yeah,
John's, Newfoundland. Thank you for sharing that, Ken.
yeah,
I'm sorry for your loss, gosh, and all that he's been through. And I would like to chat with you too, Ken, on all the intergenerational trauma that Bruce is here talking about too. So Bruce, what can we do as a nation, right? What can we do as Canadians who are very compassionate to all of these secrets that have just been uncovered more recently with the discovery of these unmarked graves? And what can we do as individuals to really to contribute to healing efforts of the Indigenous communities all across our great nation?
yeah. I think there's a lot of books that are written on the residential school experience. There's many movies that are being made on residential schools. We Were Children, to name one. Indian Horse is another one. There's so many of them out there, but there's also many documentaries on residential schools, and there's many survivors that are still here with us, but uh, we're losing them by the day. Every day we're losing so many survivors, and
Because of the age, yes.
some of them are taking their stories with them. So, learning from the survivors, listening to them. What's their story? What do they want you to know? A lot of them have carried this for a very long time, since the first abuses started on them at 5 years old. So a lot of them have shut down and haven't told anybody, or released any of that pain and suffering for that long. And with the Kamloops 215 unmarked graves being found, that opened up all of the survivors across Canada,
Mm-hmm.
and they are telling their horrific stories and experiences to anyone who can listen. I heard quite a few of them on the crisis line, but there's lots of them that still don't have that outlet. Some of them can write about it, but yeah, there's so many stories that haven't been told. It's just,
And even here in Greater Vancouver, I think Indigenous communities represent 4% of our greater population overall. But yet in the downtown east side, which is filled of homeless and addicts with drug abuse and alcohol abuse, the Indigenous communities and population represent 40% of that population. And
yeah,
to fix this addiction, right, we have to go back to that pain and why they're trying to cover up all of the hurt from what they've gone through. Yeah. And so whatever efforts we can do, how would you recommend for someone get educated, watch these shows, project the truths. What can we do to help healing individuals who are still struggling? How can we get more involved?
Listen to them, acknowledge. And if you go down to the downtown east side,
Yes.
acknowledge them and
Yes.
say, hi, who are you? You're probably a survivor of residential school. And if not, you're an intergenerational survivor.
Yes.
And more often than not, they're probably a product of the 60s scoop or the current child welfare system, right?
And what you're talking about is connection, though, that basic element of connection, human connection,
Yes.
that an entire community of Indigenous children for, what did you say, 150 years, lacked that human connection
Yeah.
with their own families, but lacked human connection within how they grew up for their entire childhood. And so this basic act of connection of what you're recommending we do, right? Go down to the downtown east side and just connect, recognize,
Yes.
validate what they've been through.
Yeah. And just know that, this is not over for many of us. It's still going on for a lot of our Indigenous people, through the child welfare system. But also, if you look at what the government is doing, to our people, the federal government, and look at what the church is doing, especially the Catholic Church. Um, our people have been asking them for records, and the bishops made an apology, and said, "Okay, you're gonna have access to our records, but at our discretion."
Mm.
And we have documentaries where the head nun out of the St. Anne's, um, I don't know, convent, I guess, in Vancouver, um, openly stated that, "Oh, we didn't know that these abuses were going on from our men." And they collaborated. The nuns collaborated with the priests. They set up those little girls for the priests and the brothers. And she says that she does not have the knowledge of that.
So worse yet, you're actually saying the abuse of power is still happening today.
Yes, we're still being
even in these reconciliation efforts, and even after this awareness has been propelled and all these uncovered truths, you're saying this abuse of power is still happening.
Yes, they're not freely, like any records. If you ask for personnel records of any residential school, St. Anne's is not giving up any of their lists of nuns that stayed there and abused children. They're not going to give that up, nor are they going to give up the priests and the brothers that were operating at these schools. And a lot of them were pedophiles, both nuns and priests.
And there are parents, there are families that still don't know what happened to their children, still today.
Yeah, that's right. Some children never got home. They would find out from children who came back in June that a child died during the winter.
But they
and
weren't
is
even
buried.
informed. They weren't even
Yeah.
informed at the
No.
time of passing. Oh my heavens.
No.
Just the neglect and abuse and the layers of cover up. And just, I can't even fathom all of this. Dan, great question. What are some great ways to keep the stories alive as the survivors pass away? Is the next generation storytelling or sharing? How can we really keep these stories alive, Bruce?
Yeah, and just retelling what stories you've heard. I mean, I hear stories all the time, and one of the biggest ones I think Canada should really look at is the unmarked graves. And there's so many of them, and we have so many witnesses to that. And we'll hear more about that with as more schools. I think the numbers are up to 9,510 unmarked graves across Canada. I know at my school, one of the testimonies from the survivor was that she witnessed the nuns and priests bringing shoe boxes. Give me a second. I have a shoe box.
Mm-hmm.
These were little coffins for babies.
Oh my gosh.
And she called it the shoebox babies because nuns and girls got pregnant from the priests and brothers. And she said they knew what to expect if anytime the nuns or the girls went full term, they knew what to expect. And what they expected was that the the head nun would come along, take the baby, and they would put the baby in a shoebox. Dead or alive, they brought the baby out into the school grounds, dug a shallow grave, and put him in there. And there are other survivors who witnessed babies and other children being brought to the furnace, the furnace to heat up the schools, and other survivors describing what was called the Black Hill.
What's that?
The Black Hill is where they cleaned out the furnaces, ashes, and they would dump it on the Black Hill. And kids playing around there found teeth in these Black Hills because teeth is probably the hardest to burn, right?
Yeah.
So these are coming from survivors. These are, witnesses to those horrific events.
It's heart-wrenching on every level to hear all of this. And as I shared at the beginning, like this idyllic childhood that I was blessed to have marked the very same grounds of the torture and abuse that happened for so many just barely years before me. And there's a small cemetery in this forest and behind the Shingwak Residential School. And my understanding, we had moved into this home when I was 5 and we'd play in that forest all the time. And my understanding of this cemetery was that it housed the remains of children who died in a school fire. And what was the residential school then became what's called Algoma University. And I always just thought the building was forever Algoma University. There's a small church in front of the university, small church that's a historic site that I always assumed growing up that was the site of the school fire. But even in my own mind as a child growing up, I always questioned, how could everybody not get it? How could nobody get out of this church in this fire? Like there were so many unanswered questions, but what it was. This is what we grew up knowing. And to know for myself that the secret's right in my own backyard. It's just so heart-wrenching for me to hear all of these stories. Gosh, Bruce, I can't thank you enough for being here today.
Check all the book lists. There's so many stories of residential school. But survivors always taught me too that there's humor. And that's they survived because of that. A lot of them that I talked to just they just had that funny side to them. And one elder shared a story about when they spoke the language, they would nickname their captors. They nicknamed this one nun. Her name was Sister Rose, but they nicknamed her Bustal. And so you're not allowed to speak the language. If you spoke the language, you would get strapped, right? So she heard them call her that, and she wanted to know what it meant. So she lined up the girls, and she asked them what it meant. Nobody would say anything because you're not supposed to speak your language. So she strapped them anyway. She lined them up and strapped them. And second time around, what does it mean? What does Bustal mean? Nobody would say anything, and they got strapped again. And then finally, on the third time, one of the girls stepped forward and finally told her because this nun was so mean all the time, wouldn't crack a smile. I don't know if you know those kind of people, but ones that always had
tight lip,
tight lips, and it was all wrinkly and mean looking, like just really sour. That's why they called her Bustal. And then this girl stepped forward and she said, Bustal. It means cat ass. So,
Well, that humor would have served them well. But on a bigger front, people also use humor as an emotional avoidance strategy,
yes, yeah,
right? And it's also a coping mechanism, just like
yeah,
alcohol, just like drugs, just
yeah,
like overeating or undereating or
yeah,
shopping too much, right? These are all emotional avoidance strategies, and humor is one. Yeah.
yeah.
Bruce, I can't tell you how much my heart appreciates your time with us today, and sharing all that you've shared with us. And to our audience, I hope you continue to share this story, share it with your audiences, continue to propel the truths of all that Canada has experienced and all that the Indigenous communities have had to endure. Do your part, validate all of the survivors, validate all of the Indigenous community for what they've had to endure, connect in the ways that you are able. Thank you, Bruce. Do you have any final words of wisdom to share with our audience?
Yeah, just I have 5 boys, and I have two grandsons and 2 granddaughters, and I just look forward to seeing them whenever I can and seeing what they're up to. The young, I have one grandson who's just turned 18 yesterday, and my youngest granddaughters are, I think they're 7 or 8 months. So
Beautiful.
quite a range, and yeah, just
They're
enjoy.
lucky to have you.
Yeah,
It's your love and your passion for ensuring that not only your own family thrives, but the entire community of Indigenous people. You're so passionate about healing measures, and I really admire you. Thank you again for being with us, Bruce.
thank you.
All the best, risers and thrivers. We hope you've really taken heart to the show and all that you've learned. Please share it with your audiences. All the best. Have a great day.